They were poor twin brothers who had dreamed all their lives of having a home of their own. When they found an abandoned mansion once visited by John F. Kennedy at an estate sale, they decided to take the risk. What they found inside shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The rain had ended sometime before dawn, leaving the streets of Boston slick and silver beneath the fading clouds. Miles Harper stood by the kitchen window of their small apartment, staring down at the cracked pavement below. For 31 years that view had not changed. The same brick buildings leaning inward, the same hum of buses from the main road, the same sense that life was always passing by just outside the window but never coming in. On the table behind him sat a folded letter, still faintly smelling of antiseptic and paper dust. It was from the hospital where their mother had died. Miles hadn't moved it since the day they received it. Their mother, Jennifer Harper, had been the kind of woman who lived quietly, but left traces of herself everywhere she went. She worked as a cleaner in offices and public buildings, sometimes even in the homes of people who never looked her in the eye. She used to tell her sons stories about those places, about polished floors that shone like mirrors and closets full of linen embroidered with names. Rich people, she'd say. They build their lives out of things they never touch. Houses too big to live in, rooms they never walk into. You can smell the dust of their comfort. For Miles, those stories had become fables, not of envy, but of distance. For Marcus, they were motivation. When she passed away, the brothers were left with almost nothing. A worn-out Ford, a little insurance money, and the ache of realizing there was no one left to call home. Marcus had spent the weeks after the funeral avoiding conversation, working long hours at a moving company, while Miles withdrew into silence, scribbling in notebooks that filled the apartment. Their mother's last words still echoed between them, though neither ever said them aloud. "You boys need to find something of your own." It was Marcus who found the listing first. He had been scrolling through property auctions online late at night, half out of habit, half out of hope, when he stopped on one that made him sit up. A large colonial house in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, described simply as historic property, requires restoration. The photos were poor. Just a few washed-out images of a pale facade behind overgrown hedges, but the price was ridiculous, less than the cost of a used car. And then he noticed the last line of the description, previously utilized by members of the Kennedy family during the early 1960s. He didn't tell Miles at first. Marcus had a habit of holding things until he could see their angle. When he finally did mention it, Miles reacted as expected, skepticism mixed with curiosity. "Why would anyone sell that cheap?" he asked. "Because it's fallen apart," Marcus replied, "or because nobody wants to touch it." A week later, they were driving south in the old Ford, its engine rattling against the wind. As the city gave way to the coast, the world grew quieter, wealthier. The air smelled of salt and pine. They passed manicured lawns, yachts moored at private docks, white fences that looked more like statements than boundaries. The deeper they drove into Hyannisport, the more Marcus felt the difference. Here, people didn't live to survive. They lived to continue a legacy. The house stood at the end of a narrow, unmarked road, hidden behind tall hedges. It was larger than either of them expected, its paint faded to the color of bone, the shutters hanging crooked like tired eyelids. A weathered flagpole leaned toward the sea. Grass reached up to the porch steps. The air smelled faintly of mildew and pine resin. Yet, despite the decay, there was something dignified about the place, something that refused to die. The real estate agent was waiting for them on the porch, a man with a crisp smile and an anxious laugh. He spoke too quickly, his words rehearsed. "Gentlemen, you'll find it's got great bones. Solid construction, original features, coastal history. Some people say President Kennedy himself visited more than once." His voice dipped slightly at the end, as if he regretted mentioning it. Marcus caught the hesitation. "Some people?" he asked. The agent smiled thinly. "Well, local legends. You know how small towns are. But, yes, it's documented that members of the family spent time here. It hasn't been occupied since the late 60s. They followed him inside. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of dust. The staircase curved upward into darkness. Faded wallpaper peeled in strips, revealing layers of older designs beneath. Flowers, stripes, a forgotten era hidden behind another. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, its mantel carved with initials too worn to read. Miles wandered slowly, trailing his fingers along the dusty banister. He noticed how the light through the salt-streaked windows fell in long, narrow bands, cutting through the gloom. He felt an odd sense of reverence, as if they had entered a church. "It feels like time stopped here," he said softly. Marcus, standing by the window, was already calculating repairs. Roof, plumbing, foundation. "Time stopped because nobody could afford to start it again," he said. The agent led them through the rooms quickly, as though afraid of lingering. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked underfoot. A hallway stretched into shadow, lined with closed doors. "You'll find all utilities are disconnected," the agent said, opening one door after another. "But the structure's sound. Just needs a little love." In one of the rooms, Miles stopped. On the wall hung a single black and white photograph, warped by moisture. It showed a group of people in summer clothes laughing on the lawn. A tall man in sunglasses stood slightly apart, his face half turned toward the camera. The resemblance was unmistakable. John F. Kennedy. The photo had yellowed around the edges, the image blurred, but the energy in it was alive. Miles stared at it for a long time. Downstairs, Marcus stood by the front door, already impatient. "So?" he said when Miles reappeared. "It's a lot of work," Miles answered. "It's a lot of history," Marcus countered. The agent sensed hesitation and jumped in. "Gentlemen, I should mention, the property has been on the market for years. The town would like to see it occupied again. Frankly, it makes the neighbors nervous, sitting empty like this. You could probably have it for less than the asking price if you move quickly." "Why nervous?" Miles asked. The agent paused, his smile twitching. "Old rumors," he said finally. "Strange things after the 60s. The last caretaker swore he heard voices, but it's just an old house settling. Nothing unusual." He said it too casually, as though he had practiced sounding unconcerned. When they stepped back outside, the wind from the ocean carried the faint cry of gulls. The house loomed behind them, its windows like tired eyes watching their every move. Marcus lit a cigarette, squinting at the roofline. "You could turn this into something," he said. "Tours, private events, a piece of history with our name on it." Miles shook his head. "It should be preserved, not marketed." Marcus laughed softly. "Preserved doesn't pay the bills." The agent handed them the papers. The ink on the contract looked darker than usual against the pale pages. "If you're serious, I can have this processed today," he said. "I'll even throw in a contact for local contractors who've worked on heritage properties." Miles hesitated, but Marcus didn't. "Let's do it," he said, signing his name. Then he handed the pen to his brother. Miles looked at the line beneath Marcus's bold handwriting, his own name waiting to join it. He thought of their mother, of her hands red from bleach, of her saying that houses held more than furniture. They held secrets. He signed. When the agent's car disappeared down the road, silence swallowed the property. The afternoon sun dipped low, turning the windows to dull mirrors. The brothers stood together on the porch, unsure of what they had really bought. That night, they stayed in the house for the first time. They set up their sleeping bags in the living room, lit candles when the flashlight batteries ran out. The house creaked and sighed with every gust of wind. In the flickering light, the walls seemed to breathe. Miles couldn't sleep. He listened to the distant crash of waves and the occasional drip from a leaking pipe. At one point, he thought he heard something shift upstairs, not loudly, just enough to make his heart quicken. Marcus, half asleep beside him, muttered, "Probably raccoons." But when the sound came again, softer, like the slow closing of a door, neither of them spoke. Sometime after midnight, Miles rose and walked into the hallway. The moonlight through the window outlined his reflection faintly against the old mirror near the staircase. For a second, he could almost swear another figure stood behind him, the trick of light and exhaustion. He turned, but the hallway was empty. He returned to his sleeping bag, shivering despite the summer warmth. Marcus rolled over, mumbling, "You awake?" Miles stared at the ceiling. "Yeah." "You still think we did the right thing?" Miles thought of the photo upstairs, the man in sunglasses laughing under the sun. Marcus chuckled softly, already drifting back into sleep. Houses don't remember. People do. But as the night stretched on, the wind rose again, sweeping through the empty rooms, and for the first time, Miles wasn't sure he believed that. Somewhere in the house, a shutter banged once, twice, then stilled, as if the building itself was breathing out after years of silence, welcoming them or warning them. When dawn came, pale and cold, Miles stepped outside and looked at the sea. The house behind him stood quiet and patient, its white paint almost glowing in the early light. Marcus joined him, yawning, his hands shoved into his pockets. "So," Marcus said, his voice rough with sleep, "what do you think now?" Miles watched the horizon, where the gray water met the sky in a line too clean to be real. "I think," he said slowly, "we just bought someone else's unfinished story." Marcus smiled faintly. "Then let's make it ours." Behind them, the front door swung open with a long, low creak, though neither had touched it. They turned to look, but the wind from the shore had already begun to rise, tugging at the ivy, making the old boards groan. It was just the house breathing, Marcus told himself, just wood and wind. But Miles, standing on the porch, felt something else entirely. Not a ghost, not a curse, but the weight of memory pressing in from every wall, whispering softly that history never truly leaves. He didn't know it yet, but that was the night the past began to wake. Morning arrived without fanfare, pale and thin, as if the sun itself was reluctant to rise over a house that had forgotten what warmth felt like. The air inside was cold enough that Miles could see his breath when he exhaled. The first light revealed what the candlelight had hidden: dust thick enough to coat everything, cobwebs looping from corners, water stains creeping down the walls like faded veins. Yet, for all its decay, the place was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, not abandoned, but waiting. Marcus stirred beneath his blanket, muttered something about coffee, and pushed himself up, blinking at the emptiness. "You'd think a president would have picked a place with better insulation," he said. His voice bounced through the open room, a reminder that the house was much larger than either of them could fill. Miles didn't answer. He was already walking slowly through the hallway, tracing his fingertips along the wall, feeling where the paint peeled like scabbed skin. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe he just wanted to understand why the air here felt heavier than it should. Every old house carried its ghosts, but this one carried memory. That subtle, living residue left by people who had believed their moments would matter forever. In the kitchen, he found a chipped mug sitting upside down in the sink, perfectly dry, as though someone had placed it there decades ago and meant to come back for it. The sink's metal reflected a dull light. The window above it faced the sea, and through the smudged glass he could see gulls circling over the shoreline. It struck him then that someone once stood here washing dishes, looking at that same view, maybe humming a tune from the radio, not knowing that time would stop just days later. Marcus joined him, yawning. "We need power and food." "There's a store in town," Miles said. "Yeah, and we need to clean this place before it kills us. I'll call a contractor about the wiring." Miles nodded absently. His attention had drifted to the staircase again. In daylight it seemed taller, more commanding. The steps creaked when he climbed them, not sharply, but with a kind of weary dignity. Upstairs the air was stale and colder still. He passed a row of closed doors and felt the peculiar stillness that comes from rooms left untouched. In what must have been a guest room, sunlight fell across the floor in pale rectangles. The same photograph he'd noticed the day before still hung on the wall. The laughing figures on the lawn, the man with the unmistakable smile. Miles stood before it for a long while, studying the edges where mold had started to eat into the paper. The faces around the president were less distinct, but one of them, a tall black man holding a camera, drew his eye. He wondered if that was the photographer mentioned in the agent's story, the one who'd vanished. There was something in the man's posture, pride, but also a quiet distance that felt familiar. When Marcus called from downstairs, Miles didn't respond immediately. He crouched near a wooden trunk by the bed, its brass latch tarnished green. It opened with a sigh. Inside were linens folded so neatly they might have been arranged yesterday, and beneath them a stack of old magazines. Life, Time, Look. Their covers showed the early 60s frozen in glossy perfection. On one page a headline read, "The President's Summer Retreat, Family and Future at Hyannisport." There was a photo that looked eerily like the lawn outside their own house. He heard Marcus's footsteps below, the scrape of a chair. Miles lifted the magazines carefully and found, pressed flat at the bottom, a sealed envelope marked in elegant handwriting, "Property of H.L. Jackson, Nov. 63. The ink had faded to a reddish-brown. He turned it over in his hands, heart quickening. It was heavier than an envelope should be, thick and stiff. Inside, when he finally dared to open it, were several strips of photographic negative curled with age. Light through the window caught faint outlines of figures, cars, a man standing with his back to the camera. Miles held one strip up, and even reversed and dark, he recognized the posture again. That same tall figure from the photo, the photographer himself. "Miles," Marcus's voice was closer now. "You alive up there?" "Yeah," he called back, still staring at the negatives. "I found something." When Marcus entered the room a minute later, he looked at the open trunk, the magazines, and the strips of film dangling between Miles's fingers. His eyebrows rose. Old photos. They're marked with a name, Miles said quietly. H.L. Jackson, November 63. Marcus whistled low. 63, huh? That's the year, isn't it? You think these are real? I don't know yet, but it's the same initials as the photographer who disappeared after Dallas. Marcus reached for the negatives, but Miles stepped back instinctively. Easy, he said. They're fragile. Marcus smiled, though his eyes glinted with something sharper. Relax, man. I just want to look. They spread the negatives carefully on the desk near the window. The shapes were faint, but unmistakable. A group of people gathered by a white fence, a convertible parked on gravel, and in one frame, a face so clear it sent a jolt through both of them. It was Kennedy, younger looking than in most official portraits, his smile open and unguarded. Miles exhaled. He was here. Marcus gave a small, triumphant laugh. You're telling me we've got original shots of JFK, maybe from his last week alive, taken by a photographer who vanished? You realize what that's worth? Miles didn't answer. He felt dizzy, the room spinning slightly. History had just become tangible, and it was lying in their hands like an exposed nerve. By late afternoon, they had gone into town with the envelope sealed again inside a cardboard tube. The drive was quiet, both lost in thought. Hyannisport in daylight was postcard perfect. Clapboard houses, neat sidewalks, flags fluttering in the breeze. People glanced at their car. Two strangers, two black men in a place that rarely saw outsiders. Marcus parked outside a small photo shop that looked as if it hadn't changed since the 70s. Inside, the air smelled of chemicals and paper. An elderly man behind the counter looked up from a tray of prints. When Miles explained what they had, the man's eyes widened slightly. You're saying these were shot in '63? You found them where? In an old house, Miles said, cautious. Well, son, if they're real, you've got something special. But film that old, you have to handle it right. I can try to make contact sheets, no promises. They left the negatives with him, signed a slip, and went for coffee while they waited. Marcus couldn't sit still. He drummed his fingers on the table. Listen, if these come out even half decent, we've got options. Private collectors, maybe a museum. Hell, a magazine would pay to run a story. Miles stirred his coffee slowly. Or we could give them to the Kennedy Library. They'd preserve them properly. Marcus looked at him incredulously. And they'd give us what? A thank you letter? No, man, this is our shot. Miles said nothing. He was looking out the window, watching the wind ripple the harbor flags. He wondered what their mother would say if she saw them now, standing on the edge of a story bigger than themselves, one that belonged to the country, and yet had somehow found its way into their hands. When they returned to the shop an hour later, the man handed them a single envelope. They're delicate, he said. Some frames are gone, but these are clear enough. Miles opened the envelope and drew out the contact sheet. His breath caught. There was Kennedy again, smiling on the lawn, jacket off, sleeves rolled up. There was the tall photographer holding his camera, captured in a reflection from a window. And, in one frame, blurred but legible, the corner of a newspaper dated November 17th, 1963. Marcus grinned. That's it. That's history. We hit gold. On the drive back, he kept talking about numbers, auctions, valuations, potential buyers. But Miles barely listened. He kept glancing at the contact sheet on somewhere between the house and this moment, 60 years had collapsed into a single heartbeat. That night, they ate takeout in the kitchen, sitting on crates. The house felt different now. Alive, expectant. Miles spread the photos on the table, using paperweights to hold the corners down. He studied the background of each image, the pattern of trees, the angle of sunlight. Every detail confirmed it. These weren't generic coastal shots. They were taken here. "You realize," Miles said quietly, "that whoever took these was with Kennedy just days before Dallas." Marcus shrugged. So what if he saw something? What if that's why he disappeared?" Marcus gave a short laugh. "Don't start with conspiracy talk. The guy probably drowned." "Maybe." Miles leaned back, staring at the photos. But these were hidden. Someone wanted them kept out of sight. Or someone forgot about them. People move, things get packed away. Don't make it bigger than it is. Miles smiled faintly. "You really think this house has forgotten anything?" Later, after Marcus had gone to bed, Miles stayed up with a flashlight, wandering through the halls. The air was still. He found himself drawn again to the photograph in the upstairs room. He compared it to the contact sheet in his hand. The same lawn, the same fence, even the same chair by the porch railing. In the silence, he imagined the laughter from that day, the click of the camera shutter, the low murmur of conversation. The man behind the lens, H.L. Jackson, had been right here, framing the world through glass, not knowing that in a few days the world would change forever. Miles lowered the flashlight. Shadows gathered at the corners of the room, deep and unmoving. He thought he heard Marcus turning in his sleep downstairs, the creak of the old floorboards. Or maybe it was the house itself, settling, remembering. He sat on the edge of the bed until his eyes adjusted to the dark. The smell of dust and salt was everywhere, seeping into his clothes, his thoughts. He felt, for the first time, not like an intruder, but like a witness. Someone chosen by accident to open a door that had stayed locked for 60 years. When dawn came again, he went outside, the negatives safely stored in his jacket. The sea stretched out gray and endless. The air was cold enough to sting. From the porch, he looked back at the house, its white walls shining faintly in the early light. Marcus appeared beside him, holding 2 mugs of instant coffee. "You've been up all night?" Marcus asked. Miles nodded. "I couldn't sleep." "Because of the pictures?" "Because of what they mean." Marcus handed him a mug. "They mean opportunity. You'll see." Miles looked at him and saw in his brother's face the same stubbornness that had carried them through every bad year, every small failure. But behind it, there was also hunger, not evil, just the quiet desperation of someone tired of losing. He sipped the bitter coffee. "Maybe," he said softly, "but history doesn't belong to the highest bidder." Marcus laughed. "Says the journalist. Says the son of a woman who cleaned other people's houses so we could have a chance to stand in our own." Marcus said nothing. The wind off the ocean gusted hard enough to rattle the shutters. They stood there a long time, each staring in a different direction. Marcus toward the road that led back to town, Miles towards the sea that seemed to go on forever. Behind them, the house stood silent, but not empty. It had begun to stir in small ways, the faint hum of air through unseen cracks, the whisper of memory brushing through its walls. Somewhere upstairs, behind a locked door neither had opened yet, something waited, patient as dust. The brothers did not know it, but the past they had awakened had only started to breathe, and the more they searched, the more it would remember them too. The following week settled into a rhythm that felt deceptively normal. Each morning the brothers rose early, though for different reasons. Miles spent hours poring over the photographs, enlarging details with a magnifying glass, sketching out what he called the geography of memory. Marcus, meanwhile, made phone calls to contractors, to an antiques dealer he knew in Boston, and, quietly, to a man who specialized in private historical acquisitions. The sound of their routines filled the empty house. The click of the typewriter Miles used for his notes, the metallic whine of Marcus's hammer as he fixed window frames, the murmured hum of the ocean through open doors. On the surface, it was domestic. Underneath, tension began to settle like silt in still water. He kept a notebook on the dining table, where dust still clung to the edges of every surface. His handwriting was tight and deliberate, each line an attempt to make sense of what they had stumbled into. He titled the first page "The Missing Photographer," and beneath that, H.L. Jackson, 1925, unknown. The story fascinated him. The idea of a man who had once been allowed into the inner circle of the most photographed presidency in history, then vanished like a shadow when the nation's heart stopped in Dallas. Jackson's name barely appeared in official records, just a few lines in the archives, a credit on 2 photographs from 1962. After November 1963, there was nothing. The more Miles read, the more questions surfaced. Why had Jackson been in Hyannisport in the days before Kennedy's final trip? Why were his photographs never published? And why had his name been so thoroughly erased from history? The envelope they found had been hidden carefully, not forgotten. That kind of secrecy wasn't accidental, it was protection, or perhaps guilt. Marcus noticed the growing obsession with quiet irritation. "You're acting like this is some government conspiracy," he said one evening, tossing a newspaper onto the table. Maybe the guy just quit. People disappear all the time. Miles didn't look up. Not people like him. Not with what he saw. Marcus sat across from him, arms crossed. "You're not hearing me. It doesn't matter what he saw. What matters is what we can do with it. If these photos are real, they're worth a fortune. We could sell just one and cover the entire renovation. You'd have money to publish your stories. I'd have enough to start that business we always talked about. Everybody wins." Miles set his pen down. "Except the truth." Marcus leaned back in his chair, smiling thinly. "Truth doesn't pay the bills." They had had versions of this argument before, about money, about purpose, about their mother's endless struggle to stay afloat. But now it was different. Now they were standing on a fault line between 2 worlds, one ruled by ideals, the other by survival. In the days that followed, the house itself seemed to echo that division. Some rooms felt bright and open, warmed by sunlight that cut through the dirty windows. Others remained stubbornly cold, as if they were holding their breath. Miles spent most of his time in the upstairs study, reading through the magazines they'd found and comparing them to the negatives. Marcus avoided that part of the house altogether. He focused instead on practical tasks, clearing debris from the yard, calling electricians, planning how the place might look as a rentable historical property. One afternoon, Miles came downstairs carrying a stack of papers. "Listen to this," he said. "I found an interview with one of Kennedy's aides from 1970. He mentioned an unofficial photographer, an African-American man who traveled with the president sometimes but wasn't on the official payroll. He said the man had a habit of asking questions nobody wanted to answer." Marcus didn't look up from his laptop. And he disappeared 2 days after Dallas. No record, no death certificate. The aide said the Secret Service never even filed a report. Marcus closed the laptop slowly. So maybe he ran. Maybe he saw something he wasn't supposed to. Or maybe someone made sure he couldn't tell anyone, Miles said quietly. The words hung in the air. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and for a moment, it sounded like distant footsteps. Later that week, Miles drove to the local library in town. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a soft voice, recognized the address as soon as he mentioned it. "You boys bought the Kennedy house," she said, half smiling. "People say it's cursed, but I've always thought it was just lonely." She led him to the archives room, a small space filled with the smell of old paper and salt air. If there's anything about Jackson, it might be in the local paper files. The Cape Herald kept everything. Hours passed as Miles sifted through microfilm and yellowed clippings. He found stories about presidential visits, charity galas, and political donors, but little about the people behind the camera. It wasn't until near closing that he spotted a brief article from December 1963, a single paragraph buried in the obituaries section. H.L. Jackson, freelance photographer, presumed deceased. Last known location, Hyannisport. Survived by no immediate family. The date made his skin crawl. It was published 2 weeks after Kennedy's funeral. Presumed deceased. No details, no cause, no investigation. That night, he returned home to find Marcus sitting on the porch, phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking in a low voice, too low to hear the words. But when he noticed Miles watching, he quickly "Contractor," Marcus said. "We're getting an estimate tomorrow." Miles nodded, unconvinced. He went inside and sat at the dining table, staring at the contact sheet of photographs. The more he looked at them, the more details seemed to emerge, like the faint reflection of a second figure in one window behind Kennedy, watching the scene unfold. He wrote late into the night, trying to fit the pieces together. The next morning, an article appeared online under his name, The Forgotten Witness, Searching for the Lost Photographer of Camelot. It was a modest piece, just a digital feature on an independent journalism site, but it carried weight. He wrote not of conspiracy, but of erasure, the quiet way history decides who gets remembered and who doesn't. He never mentioned the negatives or where they'd been found. By evening, the article had been shared dozens of times. A few small history blogs reposted it. One email stood out among the replies, a message from a Harvard historian named Dr. Elaine Ford, who specialized in 20th century political media. "If you truly have information on H.L. Jackson," she wrote, "I'd like to meet. There are things about his disappearance that were never explained." Miles printed the email and left it on the counter. When Marcus came home from the hardware store, he picked it up and read it silently. "So, now you're dragging professors into this," he said finally. "She might be able to help us understand what we found." Marcus folded the paper, his expression tightening. "Or she might take everything and make you a footnote in her book. You think people like that care about you? They care about owning the story." "She's a historian, not a buyer," Miles said. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "There's no difference." That night, the air inside the house felt heavier than usual. The temperature dropped, though the weather outside was mild. When Miles went upstairs, he heard something, a faint hum like a radio left on somewhere. He followed it to the study. The sound seemed to come from inside the wall near the old radiator. He pressed his ear against it. There was no clear voice, just the rhythm of static, the whisper of something half-formed. When he moved away, it stopped. He told himself it was pipes, air pressure, anything logical. But later, lying in bed, he thought of Jackson's camera clicking, freezing moments that shouldn't have existed. The hum returned, softer now, like a breath behind his ear. He turned over and saw Marcus sitting up across the room, staring at the same wall. "You hear that, too?" Miles whispered. Marcus nodded slowly. "It's this damn house. It creaks like it's alive." Neither spoke again. They sat in the dark until the sound faded, until sleep finally came, restless and shallow. In the morning, they found a package on the porch. There was no return address, just their names written in black marker. Inside was a plain envelope containing a printout of Miles's article and a single line typed beneath it. "Be careful what you dig up. Some ghosts still have friends." Marcus swore and tossed it onto the table. "That's it. I told you this was a bad idea." "It's probably a prank," Miles said, though his voice was unsteady. "Or someone doesn't want this story told." Miles looked around the room, at the framed photograph still hanging crookedly on the wall, at the dust motes drifting in the light. "Maybe," he said softly, "but it's already started talking to us." Later, when Marcus left to meet a potential contractor, Miles took the negatives and locked them in a metal box. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching. That night, after the house fell quiet, he opened the window of the study. The ocean wind rushed in, cool and briny, carrying the smell of rain. Somewhere below, a shutter banged once, then again, like a heartbeat. He stood there a long time, listening. The house had two voices now, his own thoughts and the echo of the past rising through the walls. He didn't yet know which one would win. For the next several days, the house seemed to sink into a strange calm. The brothers worked in silence most mornings, their paths rarely crossing except at meals. The tension that had simmered between them since the night of the warning letter hung like humidity in the air, thick, invisible, inescapable. Miles spent his hours rereading the article he'd written, regretting the attention it had drawn. The message on the porch still burned in his mind. Some ghosts still have friends. Every creak in the house now felt like a whisper of that unseen presence. Marcus, for his part, had become restless and impatient. He spent long stretches outside on the porch making calls, pacing with the phone. Then, one morning, a pair of local laborers arrived to begin the first phase of renovation. They were men in their 50s, thick-handed and quiet, sent by a contractor Marcus had found through one of his contacts. Miles didn't like them. They moved through the house like people entering a church with no faith left, glancing at the walls too long, whispering to each other in Portuguese when they thought no one listened. Still, he let them work. The foundation needed inspection, the walls needed reinforcement, and the basement, the most neglected part of the house, was to be cleared and made safe. Marcus joined them in the basement on the first day, flashlight in hand, barking orders about which debris to move and which beams to leave. The smell down there was of earth and salt and something faintly metallic. The air felt wrong, too dense, as if it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Dust motes shimmered in the flashlight beam like tiny ghosts. Miles stayed upstairs until he heard one of the workers call out sharply. His voice echoed up through the vents. "Senor Marcus, ven ver, come see." Miles went to the basement door and found Marcus standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring at a section of the far wall. The workers had stripped away rotting paneling and plaster, revealing a patch of smooth, pale wood that didn't match the rest of the foundation. It was newer, cleaner, and behind it something hollow whispered when tapped. "What is it?" Miles asked, descending the steps. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He pressed his ear against the wall. "There's space behind it," he said finally. "Like a room." The workers exchanged nervous glances. One crossed himself, muttering something under his breath. "Can you open it?" Marcus asked. One of them hesitated. "Maybe not good idea, senor. Some things better left alone." Marcus gave a short laugh. "You're getting superstitious now?" He grabbed a crowbar and wedged it between the boards. They came loose with surprising ease. Dust poured out like smoke, carrying the smell of old paper and something else, something faintly sour, like mildew mixed with oil. The opening revealed a small space, barely larger than a closet. Miles lifted his flashlight, sweeping it across the interior. The beam caught on an object in the corner, a metal chair rusted through at the legs. Beside it, on a small wooden shelf, sat an old reel-to-reel tape recorder coated in grime, its reels still threaded with tape. Next to it were several small boxes, each labeled in neat handwriting, dates ranging from October to November 1963. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against their throats. Marcus finally broke the silence. "Holy shit!" Miles stepped forward, his heart hammering. The boxes were perfectly aligned, untouched by rodents or decay. He reached out carefully, brushing away a layer of dust to read the labels more clearly. Nov. 10. Private. Nov. 17. Dallas trip discussion. Nov. 19. Final prep. He felt his mouth go dry. "These could be his," he whispered. "Jackson's." Marcus crouched beside him, excitement flickering in his eyes. "Tapes? You think there's something on them?" "There's only one way to find out." They carried the recorder and the tapes upstairs to the dining room table. The machine was heavier than it looked, but miraculously intact. The plug was brittle, the cord frayed, but Miles managed to connect it through an adapter. The first tape they tried refused to spin, the reel frozen from age. The second moved reluctantly, emitting a low hum before sputtering to life. Static filled the room. Then, faintly, a voice emerged. A man's voice, low and deliberate. "Understand, this can't leave here. Too many eyes already." Another voice interrupted, sharper, authoritative. "He'll do as he's told. The photographs are locked up. The boy knows his place." Marcus froze. Miles turned up the volume, his pulse racing. "We can't risk exposure before Dallas. If he talks, it's not just him." The tape stuttered, crackled, then fell silent. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the walls closer. "Jesus Christ," Marcus muttered finally. "Is that what I think it is?" Miles rewound the tape slightly, playing the same section again. The words were unmistakable. It was a private conversation. Powerful men planning something that history would later reduce to speculation. The boy they mentioned had to be Jackson. Miles leaned back, his mind spinning. These tapes, they could rewrite everything. Marcus's eyes gleamed. "They could make us, you mean? Do you have any idea what people would pay for this?" Miles stared at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious. This isn't memorabilia, Marcus. This is evidence, real history." "History doesn't pay our mortgage," Marcus shot back. "We could sell copies, release just enough." Miles slammed his palm against the table. "Do you hear yourself? This isn't about profit. Someone died because of what's on these tapes." The sound of his voice echoed through the house. For a long time, neither spoke again. The only noise was the soft whir of the tape reel slowing to a stop, the thin hiss of silence resuming its dominion. That night, Miles couldn't sleep. He sat alone in the living room listening to the waves outside crash against the shore. The wind moaned through the chimney like a sigh. He thought about Jackson, this man who had stood so close to power, who had seen something that frightened the wrong people, who had hidden his evidence here and vanished. Around midnight, he heard Marcus on the phone again. His brother's voice was low, urgent, but the words were clear enough through the thin walls. Yes, recordings. Authentic. No, I'm not saying we sell all of them, just one. Enough to prove it's real. Yes, we can arrange delivery. Miles's stomach turned. He stepped into the hallway, waiting for Marcus to hang up. When he did, Miles confronted him. "Who are you talking to?" Marcus didn't flinch. "A contact. Someone who knows collectors who'll pay top dollar for this. You're out of your mind." "I'm trying to survive," Marcus snapped. "All your talk about truth and justice doesn't put food on the table. We have nothing, Miles. Nothing but this. We deserve something back." Miles's voice softened. "We deserve peace, Marcus, not blood money." For a moment, something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Doubt, maybe guilt, but it passed quickly. "Peace doesn't exist for people like us," he said. "Not unless we buy it." He left the room, the floorboards groaning beneath his steps. The next morning, Miles contacted Dr. Ford. He told her about the tapes, though not their exact contents, and asked for guidance on preservation. She was cautious, but intrigued. "If what you have is genuine," she said, "it belongs in an archive. But be careful. Political history has a long memory, and not everyone appreciates the resurrection of old ghosts." Miles thanked her and agreed to meet the following week. He didn't mention it to Marcus. By afternoon, the contractors had finished their work and packed up their tools. One of them, the older of the two, approached Miles before leaving. "You find something down there?" he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Miles hesitated. "Maybe." The man nodded slowly. "I work in old houses 30 years. Some things in walls, they stay there for a reason. You be careful, senor." When they were gone, the house fell silent again. Miles walked to the basement, flashlight in hand. The small hidden room gaped open like a wound. He stepped inside, feeling the chill of undisturbed air wrap around him. On the far wall, faint pencil marks scrawled across the plaster caught his light. Dates, numbers, and 3 words written larger than the rest. "If found, tell the truth." He stood there for a long time, staring at the handwriting until the sound of footsteps above reminded him he wasn't alone. That night, Marcus was gone for hours. He didn't say where he'd been when he returned. His eyes were tired. His clothes smelled faintly of gasoline and sea air. He dropped his keys on the counter and poured himself a drink without a word. Miles didn't ask. He knew the answer wouldn't matter anymore. Something had shifted between them, something final. The house felt it too, the air heavier, the silence sharper. It was as if the building itself could sense that the 2 men who had awakened it now stood on opposite sides of its memory. When Miles finally went to bed, he dreamed of the basement, the hidden room glowing faintly from within, the chair upright again, the tape recorder spinning on its own, and through the hum of the reel, a voice whispered, barely audible but unmistakable, "Truth has a price." He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the echo of that voice still in his ears. From somewhere down the hall came the sound of a door closing softly. Whether it was Marcus or the house itself, he couldn't tell. The boundary between them, between past and present, brother and brother, had thinned to something fragile, and before long it would break. Morning crept into the house as if it were uncertain of its welcome. Thin light filtered through the salt-streaked windows, falling in cold strips across the dining table where the tapes still sat. The room smelled faintly of metal and dust, the air unmoving. Miles had barely slept. He had lain awake, listening to the shifting groans of the old structure, to Marcus pacing somewhere downstairs, to the soft, mechanical click that his mind kept mistaking for the start of another recording. He came down at dawn, his eyes heavy, and found his brother. Marcus's face was pale but alert, as though he'd been up all night making decisions that could not be undone. Miles said nothing at first. He poured himself a cup of coffee, its taste bitter and acrid, and stood by the window. Outside, the sea was a dull pewter color under a low ceiling of clouds. The horizon looked flat and tired. "You met someone last night," Miles said quietly, still looking outside. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Does it matter?" "It does, if it involves those tapes." Marcus set his phone down on the table. "You don't get it, do you? We're sitting on something that could change everything for us. You keep talking about truth and legacy like we're historians. We're not. We're two broke men with a chance to stop being broke." Miles turned to face him. "By selling a dead man's evidence? By turning history into currency?" "History is already currency," Marcus shot back. "You think the Kennedys kept their legacy clean out of honesty? They bought it. They curated it. They paid people to tell the version they wanted. Why shouldn't we get something out of the real story?" Miles felt anger rise in his throat, but he forced it down. Because once you sell the truth, it stops being truth. It becomes a product. Marcus laughed dryly. "You sound like Mom, always talking about dignity, as if that ever paid a bill." The mention of their mother was like striking a match in dry air. Miles's expression hardened. She believed in earning peace, not profit. She cleaned the offices of men who built their empires on secrets. She knew what hiding the truth costs. "And look where it got her," Marcus said. The words came out before he could stop them. For a second they hung in the air, cruel and irreversible. Miles's face went still, all warmth draining from it. Marcus looked down at his hands, realizing what he'd done. "I didn't mean—" "Yes," Miles said softly. "You did." They stood in silence for a long moment. The house seemed to listen. Then Marcus turned away, grabbing his jacket. "There's a reporter in Boston who's interested," he said. "He can verify the tapes, pay us enough to rebuild this place. You can have your museum or whatever you want after that. You're not taking them." "I already made copies," Marcus said. "You think I'd be stupid enough to leave everything in one box?" Miles's breath caught. "You did what?" But Marcus was already walking toward the door. "Don't try to stop me." Miles didn't. He watched as the door closed and the sound of Marcus's car faded down the road. The silence that followed was immense, the kind that pressed into the bones. He stood for a long time before sitting down at the table again. The tapes gleamed faintly in the dim light, their reels motionless, like dormant hearts. Later that morning, the knock on the door came not from Marcus, but from a pair of men in suits. They introduced themselves politely as representatives from the Kennedy Foundation. Their voices were calm, their smiles professional, but there was something too careful in the way they looked around the room. "We understand you've come across some historical materials belonging to the former president," one of them said. "We'd like to assist with their preservation and ensure they're handled appropriately." Miles met their gaze steadily. "How did you hear about them?" "We follow these things," the man replied. Artifacts have a way of resurfacing. It's best when they're managed quietly. Miles felt a chill run through him. He thought of Marcus's phone calls, of the contacts he'd mentioned. "You've already spoken to my brother, haven't you?" The man hesitated. "We're aware of Mr. Harper's inquiries." Miles folded his arms. "Then you know I won't be selling anything. These tapes aren't property. They're history, and they belong in an archive where the public can hear them." The man's smile didn't falter, but it cooled. "I understand your position, but I must advise you to be cautious. Sometimes, when sensitive materials come to light, misunderstandings occur. Documents disappear. People's reputations get tangled in things they don't fully grasp. I'm sure you wouldn't want that." Miles's heartbeat quickened. "Is that a threat?" The man looked mildly surprised. "Of course not. Just advice." He handed Miles a card. "If you change your mind, call us. We can make this easy for everyone." After they left, Miles locked the doors and went upstairs. He hid the original tapes in the space behind the fireplace where loose bricks could be shifted aside, a trick his mother had once used to hide rent money from landlords. As he worked, the thought of Marcus handing over copies to strangers gnawed at him. It wasn't just betrayal. It was desecration. By evening, Marcus still hadn't returned. Miles sat at the desk in the He imagined the man developing his film in some quiet dark room, hands trembling as he realized what he'd captured, images or voices that could never be shown. Did he trust someone who betrayed him too? Or did he hide everything here, hoping someone like Miles might find it one day and do the right thing? The sound of a car pulling up outside jolted him. He went to the window and saw Marcus's truck, headlights cutting through the mist. His brother climbed out slowly, his shoulders slumped. Miles met him at the door, ready to argue, but something in Marcus's face stopped him. "They knew," Marcus said hoarsely. "Before I even said a word, they knew about the tapes. They said they were part of an ongoing federal review, that if I didn't cooperate, I could be charged with possession of classified materials." Miles's stomach sank. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. I walked out, but they followed me halfway home." He looked at Miles, eyes wide with something between fear and anger. "You brought them here, didn't you? That article of yours, now everyone knows." Miles shook his head. "I didn't name the location. Someone else must have leaked it." Marcus ran a hand through his hair. "They're going to come for them, you know. Those tapes. They'll take them, erase them, make sure nobody ever hears what's on them." "Then we need to get them somewhere safe," Miles said. Marcus gave a hollow laugh. "Safe? There's no such thing, not with people like that." They argued again, softer this time but with more weight. Every word between them carried years of resentment, of what they'd become and what they'd lost. Marcus wanted to disappear, to take the money he'd made from the partial deal and vanish somewhere far away. Miles wanted to fight, to make the tapes public no matter the risk. They stood on opposite sides of the same truth, each convinced the other was blind. That night, Miles went out for a walk along the beach. The sky was a low, unbroken gray, the air heavy with mist. He tried to think of what to do, but the sea offered no answers. When he returned, the lights in the house were out, except for a single one burning in the living room. Marcus sat in the chair by the window, staring at the darkness outside. "I've been thinking," Marcus said without turning around. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's not about the money anymore. Maybe it's about doing something that lasts." Miles hesitated. "What are you saying?" Marcus looked up, his expression unreadable. "Give them to your historian friend. Let her take them. Just don't tell anyone where the originals are until she confirms they're real. That way, nobody can bury them again." Miles felt relief flood through him, tempered by suspicion. "You mean it?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, I'm tired, man. I just want this done." They shook hands, a gesture that felt like truce, though something in Marcus's grip was unsteady. The next morning, Miles packed the tapes into a box and prepared to drive to Cambridge for his meeting with Dr. Ford. Marcus helped carry the box to the car, silent except for the sound of their footsteps on gravel. As Miles started the engine, he noticed Marcus standing back, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. For the first time, his brother looked old, worn down by choices that had eaten away at his certainty. "Be careful," Marcus said. Miles nodded and drove away. When he arrived at Harvard, the meeting went smoothly at first. Dr. Ford examined the tapes, her eyes widening as she read the dates. If these are authentic, they could change how historians view the last weeks of Kennedy's presidency. "We'll need to verify the voices, of course, but—" She stopped mid-sentence as her assistant entered the room holding a note. She read it, frowned, and looked back at Miles. "Mr. Harper, there are men outside asking to speak with you. They say they're with the Federal Archive Division." Miles's heart sank. He didn't wait to see who they were. He grabbed the box, mumbled an apology, and hurried out through the back exit. His phone buzzed, Marcus calling, but he ignored it. He drove without direction, instincts guiding him away from the city toward the coast. By the time he reached the house again, dusk had fallen. The wind off the ocean was cold and sharp. He parked, killed the lights, and sat for a moment staring at the front door. Something felt wrong. The porch light, which Marcus always left on, was dark. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though there was no fire. Inside, the house was silent. He called out his brother's name once, then again. No answer. In the living room, he found the table cleared, the boxes of tapes gone. Only the empty reels remained, the metal cool under his fingers. On the wall above the fireplace, the old photograph of Kennedy had been taken down. In its place was a single note pinned neatly to the frame. "I did what I had to. Don't." The handwriting was Marcus's. Miles stood there a long time, the note trembling in his hand. He didn't know whether to feel relief or grief. He looked around at the hollow rooms, the shadows stretching long and thin, and realized that the house had fallen silent again. Not just empty, but spent, as if it had witnessed one too many betrayals and finally decided to keep its secrets. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the cry of distant gulls. Miles stepped onto the porch and watched the horizon fade into darkness. Somewhere, his brother was driving away with the only remaining copies of history. Whether he intended to protect them or destroy them, Miles didn't know. But as the night deepened, he felt a strange calm. The line between them had finally been drawn, not of hatred, but of difference. One sought freedom through truth, the other through escape. The house stood between them, a silent witness to both paths. When dawn broke again, Miles would begin his search anew. But for that night, he let the wind speak for both of them. The ocean roared, the floorboards creaked, and the house, holding its breath, waited to see which of its sons would return first. The morning after Marcus's disappearance broke gray and unsteady, the air heavy with the kind of silence that follows a storm which has left everything standing, but nothing quite the same. The house felt emptier than ever. Miles woke on the couch, still wearing yesterday's clothes, the note from his brother lying open on the table. He had read it so many times that the words had begun to lose meaning, dissolving into mere shapes of ink. I did what I had to. Don't follow me. The truth's safe, for now. The handwriting was familiar yet hurried, uneven. Marcus had written it fast, perhaps before changing his mind. Miles stared at it until the letters blurred, then set it aside and looked around the room. It struck him that the house no longer seemed menacing or mysterious. It had simply reverted to being what it was, an old place filled with dust and consequence. Too many secrets for its thin walls. For weeks it had pulsed with discovery and tension, the strange electricity of history awakening. Now it was only quiet. He made coffee and walked out onto the porch. The sea was pale and still, a sheet of pewter light stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, Marcus was driving, perhaps carrying the only remaining evidence of the truth they had unearthed. Miles felt no anger toward him anymore, only a weary sadness. His brother had always wanted to win at life, to stop being at the mercy of it. The tapes had been his chance. Maybe, in his own way, he thought he was protecting them both. The following days passed in a blur of calls, visits, and questions. Journalists began to appear, drawn by whispers that the Kennedy Foundation's quiet inquiries had stirred. Some claimed to know about the tapes, others were chasing rumors of new revelations. Miles said nothing. He refused interviews, kept the doors locked, ignored the knocking that came every afternoon. Dr. Ford left 2 messages on his phone, her tone calm but urgent. Miles, whatever you have, it's not safe to keep there. Let us archive it properly. Don't let it disappear again. Disappear again. That phrase haunted him. By the end of the week, he decided to go back to Cambridge to meet her. Not with the originals, those were gone with Marcus, but with his notes, transcriptions of what he had heard. He packed a folder into his bag, drove north, and tried not to look back at the house in the mirror. Dr. Ford greeted him in her office with the tired patience of someone who had been waiting too long for a fragile truth. She read through his transcriptions in silence, occasionally glancing up at him. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. If these words are authentic, they're extraordinary. But they'll never see daylight without proof. The government has an iron grip on this period. If they decide this material is national security sensitive, they'll bury it forever. Then what can I do? Miles asked. Tell the story anyway, she said, without the tapes, without names. Write what you know, what you lived. People believe people, not recordings. The advice seemed too simple to carry any weight, but as he drove back home through the darkening afternoon, it began to settle in him like a slow realization. Perhaps truth didn't always need to survive as evidence. Maybe its power was in being spoken, remembered, retold. When he reached the house again, the porch light was on. He hadn't left it that way. For a moment, he froze, every sense sharpening. The wind had picked up, moaning softly through the reeds. He stepped inside carefully, calling out his brother's name, though he didn't expect an answer. The living room was empty, but the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered, the kind Marcus. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single photograph, Marcus standing on a pier, smiling faintly, the ocean behind him blinding with sunlight. Written on the back, in his brother's cramped handwriting, were 4 words. Heard, safe, tell it right. For a long moment, Miles couldn't breathe. The photograph felt impossibly alive, like a pulse between his fingers. It wasn't just proof that Marcus was alive. It was an instruction, a charge. His brother had taken the truth out of reach of those who wanted to erase it, but the burden of telling it was now his. In the weeks that followed, Miles began to write. He used the dining room table as his desk, the sea as his metronome. The first draft was clumsy, too emotional, too full of anger. He rewrote it again and again, stripping away accusation and fear until only the bones of the story remained. A photographer who disappeared for knowing too much, two brothers who found what he left behind, and the choice that divided them. One choosing silence, the other the voice. His article grew into a book, and his book grew into a movement. Small at first, letters from academics, students, old journalists who remembered the 1960s. Then larger, reaching readers across the country. Some called it fiction, others called it testimony. No one could verify the tapes, they were never seen again. But the story took on its own life, its own rhythm. People began to ask questions history had long ago learned not to answer. Still, for all the public noise, the nights remained quiet. When the house finally gained electricity again, Miles rarely turned on more than one light at a time. He still heard the occasional creak that reminded him of the night they had opened the hidden room, the faint metallic whisper of a reel spinning somewhere deep in memory. He never went back into the basement. Some doors, once opened, no longer need revisiting. Months passed, the seasons changed. The snow came early that year, turning the coast white and sharp. The house, once a place of secrecy, now stood as a kind of lighthouse for those who came seeking it. Visitors arrived sometimes, journalists, historians, students. They'd ask about the tapes, about Marcus, about what was true. Miles never gave a straight answer. He would only say, "There are many kinds of truth. Some you prove, others you preserve." Then, one afternoon, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a small cassette tape wrapped in cloth. A note accompanied it. "You were right. Keep this one safe. Don't play it until it matters." The handwriting was Marcus's. Miles turned the tape over in his hand. It wasn't one of the original reels. This was newer, copied, clean. He placed it in a drawer, locked it, and didn't look at it again for months. But knowing it existed changed everything. It meant Marcus hadn't disappeared into greed or guilt. He had chosen a harder path, carrying the truth where no one could reach it. Years later, when Miles's book was adapted into a documentary, people began calling the house the Kennedy Witness Home. He hated the name, but tolerated it. He kept the tours small, intimate. He wanted people to feel the silence, to understand that history wasn't just words and dates, but lives that bled into one another. He guided visitors himself, his voice steady, his hair now streaked with gray. Sometimes when he spoke of his brother, his throat tightened, but he never let it break his composure. One evening, long after the tourist had gone, he sat alone in the living room, the light from the fireplace flickering across the walls. The sea outside was loud again, the wind pushing against the windows like a restless animal. He reached into the drawer and took out the cassette. The note was still there. "Don't play it until it matters." He hesitated, then placed it into the old tape deck. The machine clicked, hissed, and for a moment there was only static. Then came Marcus's voice, older, tired, but unmistakable. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, or I've decided it's time you knew. I didn't sell the tapes. I gave them to people who will keep them hidden until it's safe. They'll outlive both of us. You were right, Miles. Truth isn't what you keep. It's what you leave behind. so tell it. Don't let them turn it into something else." The message ended with the sound of wind and seagulls, the same sounds that filled the air outside now. Miles sat for a long time, the fire burning low. When he finally turned off the tape, he didn't feel grief. He felt completion. He rose, crossed to the window, and opened it. The cold air flooded in, sharp and clean. He could see the ocean glimmering under the moonlight, endless and patient. Somewhere beyond that horizon, his brother had found his peace, not in money or power, but in anonymity, and having done one right thing at the end. The house settled around him, the floorboards shifting softly as if in agreement. It no longer felt haunted. It felt inhabited, by memory, by truth, by the simple echo of two voices that had learned, finally, to speak in harmony. When he turned back to the fire, the light caught the old photograph of Kennedy and Jackson still hanging on the wall. He smiled. History had a way of hiding its real witnesses in plain sight, but sometimes, if one listened carefully enough, the silence told the story anyway. That night, Miles slept deeply for the first time in years. Outside, the sea kept its rhythm, endless and unjudging, carrying the weight of everything that had been lost and everything that had finally been found. Years passed quietly, as if time itself had grown cautious about disturbing what remained of the Harper brothers' story. The sea still broke against the rocks beyond the lawn, whispering the same old song it had sung since the house was built. But everything else had changed. The once forgotten mansion had become a place of quiet pilgrimage, though not for the reason people imagined. They came not for Kennedy, nor for the myths of power and scandal, but for what lingered after. The story of two brothers who unearthed a secret and found something larger than any headline, the weight of truth and what it costs to carry. Miles Harper had aged into a man both softened and sharpened by solitude. His hair had turned the color of salt, his hands lined with ink and years, but his eyes still carried that same flicker of searching light, as though he were perpetually looking for a sentence not yet written. He had made a life in the house that once nearly consumed him. Now it was his work, his devotion, and his redemption. The Kennedy estate had become more than a relic. It was a museum, though not an official one, sustained by donations and care. It drew the curious, the students, the weary seekers who wanted to believe that truth could still live somewhere, untouched by spin or profit. Each morning, Miles walked the halls before opening hours. The floors no longer groaned in protest beneath his steps. They accepted him. He would pause by the old photograph in the upstairs hallway, Kennedy on the lawn, the photographer behind the lens, and feel the same quiet wonder that had once upended his life. The photo had been cleaned and restored, framed in oak. Beneath it hung a small brass plaque engraved with the words, H.L. Jackson, 1963, Property of History. He always lingered there. Sometimes he would whisper under his breath, "You were heard." Downstairs, the rooms were arranged as they might have been in the 60s, typewriter on the desk, rotary phone on the table, even a reproduction of the old tape recorder, though the real one was long gone. People who visited often spoke in hushed tones, as though afraid to wake whatever ghosts might still be listening. Miles encouraged that reverence. He believed some stories deserved silence more than applause. It was early spring when the letter arrived. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting unfamiliar. He opened it by the window where the afternoon sun fell across his hands. Inside was a single page. Mr. Harper, I am the granddaughter of Dr. Elaine Ford. My grandmother passed last winter. Among her papers, I found a transcript of a conversation she recorded years ago, your brother's voice and yours. She wanted you to have it. She called it the final dialogue. I don't know what it means, but she said you would. Folded within was a compact disc labeled in faded pen. November 12th, 2015, Hyannisport. Miles stared at it for a long time, the air around him suddenly still. He didn't own a CD player anymore, but he found one in storage, an old portable model once used for audio tours. He placed the disc inside, pressed play, and waited. The recording began with static, then Dr. Ford's voice, steady, academic, slightly softened by age. Interview with Marcus Harper, conducted at an undisclosed location. Subject wishes to remain off record. Miles's chest tightened. He hadn't heard his brother's voice in years, not since that final tape, not outside of memory. But when it came, it was unmistakable. Older, roughened, weary, but alive. I told him I'd keep it safe, Marcus said on the recording. And I did. But safety's just another form of hiding, isn't it? We spent our whole lives trying to be safe, from debt, from failure, from being forgotten. He wanted to tell the truth. I wanted to survive it. Maybe both were right. Dr. Ford's voice. Do you regret what you did? A long pause. Then Marcus sighed. No, regret's a luxury for people who never had to choose between truth and peace. But I hope he understood. I wasn't right. The sound of waves filled the background, faint but real. Miles could picture it, his brother sitting near the shore, probably looking out at the same horizon he saw now through the window. The interviewer asked, And the tapes? Where are they now? Marcus chuckled softly. Somewhere they can't be bought. Somewhere they'll wait until people are ready to hear, not to sell. You can't force the truth into the world. You can only guard it until the world grows brave enough to face it. The recording ended there. Miles sat still, listening to the silence that followed, his hand resting lightly on the player. He closed his eyes. The years between them folded like a map. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what Marcus had carried, not betrayal, but burden. His brother had never sought wealth after all. He had sought forgiveness. That night, the sea was restless again, wind tearing across the dunes, rattling the shutters. Miles stayed up by the fireplace, the CD case lying open beside him. He thought about what Marcus had said, the world not yet ready. Maybe he was right. Truth wasn't something you revealed. It was something you tended, like a flame that could either illuminate or burn. He rose, moved to the desk, and began to write once more. His next book wouldn't be about Kennedy or Jackson. It would be about Marcus. About two brothers standing on opposite sides of a story that neither owned, but both protected. He titled the first chapter, The House That Learned to Speak. The words came slowly at first, then all at once. He wrote until dawn, until the room filled with the thin pink light of morning. Outside, the tide had come in high, nearly touching the edge of the lawn. The sea was alive with movement. By summer, the new book was finished. Critics called it elegiac, restrained, haunting. They said it was less about history and more about inheritance, the way secrets pass through blood like salt through water. Miles did not care for the reviews. What mattered to him were the letters that came in response, from readers who said it made them remember their own lost siblings, their own silenced truths. He kept those letters in a wooden box under his desk, alongside the photograph Marcus had sent from the pier. On the back, the ink had begun to fade, but the words were still there. Heard, safe, tell it right. Late that autumn, a new visitor arrived, a young journalist, polite but persistent, who said he was working on a documentary about historical cover-ups. He had bright eyes and a kind of nervous reverence for the house. "I read your book," he said. "I was wondering, do you think the tapes will ever surface?" Miles smiled faintly. "Maybe, when they're ready." The young man frowned. "You make it sound like they're alive." "In a way, they are," Miles said. "Every truth has its own timing. Force it too soon and it dies. Wait long enough and it begins to speak for itself." The visitor left with more questions than answers, but Miles was content. The world didn't need another revelation. It needed patience. That night, after locking up, he walked down to the beach. The sand was cold beneath his shoes, the tide pulling softly at the shore. He stood there, listening. The sea always sounded like breathing, endless, forgiving. He thought about Marcus again. Sometimes he imagined his brother still out there somewhere, living quietly under another name, walking along some distant coastline with the same restless eyes, watching the same kind of sea. Sometimes he believed it outright. Other times it didn't matter. In truth, Marcus was here, woven into the walls, the air, the story itself. When he returned inside, the house felt warmer. He lit the small lamp in the study, its glow catching the frames on the wall. Among them was one final plaque he had added just months ago. It read, "The Harper Brothers Archive, in memory of those who saw and remembered." He stood before it, feeling the strange symmetry of it all. The house had begun as a secret, become a wound, and ended as a voice. It had taught him that silence was not the absence of truth, but the space it grows in. He reached out and touched the frame, the wood smooth beneath his fingertips, and whispered, "You're home now, Marcus." Outside, the wind eased. The house seemed to exhale with him, settling into its foundations. Somewhere within the old pipes, the faint hum of air moved, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. As the night deepened, Miles sat by the window, watching the ocean shimmer beneath the moon. The waves rose and fell with the same quiet persistence that had carried them through everything. Grief, guilt, discovery, forgiveness. He felt no loneliness anymore, only continuity. When dawn arrived, the light spilled gently across the floors, illuminating the dust like gold. The house, long accused of holding Miles smiled, his reflection faint in the glass, and for a fleeting second he could almost see his brother standing beside him, older, calmer, unburdened. The illusion lasted only a moment, but it was enough. The house had learned to speak, and it would keep speaking long after the last of them was gone. And in its quiet, enduring voice, it would carry everything they had ever been. The truth, the cost, and the fragile grace of two men who had finally, in their own ways, found peace. Don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. More real stories, more hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. Watch the next video right now and see how far one secret can go.